Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. This article helps us understand the security and law and order situation in Nagaland and as well as the special provisions that Nagaland enjoys under Article 371A of the Indian Constitution. The Governor of Nagaland has written a letter to the state's Chief Minister highlighting how armed gangs are running their own parallel governments, thereby threatening the state's law and order situation and as well as posing a challenge to the legitimacy of the government. Such armed gangs are known to operate across northeastern states which are affected by insurgency, and in most cases these armed outfits are tied to the insurgent and militant groups as well. Amongst the northeastern states, Nagaland is one of the most affected by the existence of such armed groups which run their own parallel governments. These armed outfits, they run their own mafia and they control trade and the movement of goods in the state. These groups, they impose their own illegal taxes on local businesses, and those who fail to pay up, they are extorted at gunpoint by threatening them with kidnapping and murder. So the governor of the state, Mr. R.N. Ravi, has written to the Chief Minister highlighting the failure of the state government and the state police to offer any sort of meaningful resistance to these armed groups, which have openly managed to challenge the legitimacy of the government. According to the governor, this failure to enforce law and order in the state has created a crisis of confidence in the system, and the imposition and collection of these illegal taxes by the armed groups is also affecting the state's revenue. This in turn has affected the availability of funds for socio-economic development, and its impact can be felt when you look at the poor developmental parameters of Nagaland. The governor has written that the prevailing law and order situation in Nagaland is directly responsible for poor infrastructure, poor healthcare and poor education in the state. In this context, Governor R.N. Ravi, who has considerable expertise in the Northeast, having served as the Special Director of the Intelligence Bureau and as India's Deputy National Security Advisor, has written to the Chief Minister reminding him of the special powers that the Office of the Governor of Nagaland enjoys under Article 371A, Clause 1, Subclause B of the Indian Constitution. So in this context, let us take a quick look at the special provisions that Nagaland has been provided with under Article 371A of the Constitution. See, just like the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, which had been given special provisions under Article 370, which was repealed last year, a number of other states as well have been given special provisions from Article 371A to Article 371J. Amongst these states, Nagaland is one of them, and it enjoys special provisions under Article 371A of the Indian Constitution. According to this article, no act of the Parliament shall apply to the state of Nagaland which could affect the religious and social practices of the Nagas, their customary laws and procedures. Then no act of the Parliament shall apply which can affect the customary laws related to civil administration and criminal justice, and no law passed by the Parliament shall apply to Nagaland which affects ownership of land, transfer of land and its resources. According to the article, if the laws passed by the Parliament have to be made applicable to the state, then the Legislative Assembly of the state must pass a suitable resolution. Then we have Clause 1, Subclause B under the article, which provides a set of special responsibilities to the Governor of Nagaland with regard to law and order in the state. These special powers allows the Governor of Nagaland to make decisions in matters related to law and order, even though the Governor is required to consult the Council of Ministers as per Article 163. He has been given special powers under this clause of Article 371A to exercise his individual judgment as well in matters related to law and order of the state. So in his letter, Governor R.N. Ravi has reminded the Chief Minister of his constitutional obligations under Article 371A, Clause 1, Subclause B, and he has informed the state government that all transfers and postings of key officials involved in the maintenance of law and order at the district level and above shall be done with his prior approval. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6, which deals with the topic of custodial deaths. See, while enforcing the COVID-19 lockdown, numerous incidents of police excesses have been reported from around the country. Videos have emerged which show how police officers have resorted to unnecessary violence and excessive use of force in order to enforce the lockdown restrictions. In a number of cases, they have even tried to publicly humiliate those who were found to be violating the lockdown restrictions, and all these acts fall under the definition of police excesses. Amongst all these police excesses reported during the lockdown, the most shocking incident comes from Tamil Nadu, which involves the custodial death of two individuals. These two individuals were taken into police custody for violating the lockdown restrictions, and now they have reportedly died while being in police custody. These shocking custodial deaths are currently being investigated through a magisterial inquiry as mandated by law, and the concerned police officers have already been suspended. So this incident brings us to the topic of custodial deaths in India. See, according to data made available by the National Crime Records Bureau, for the year 2017, around 100 custodial deaths were reported in India. According to NCRB's data, these custodial deaths would have occurred due to a number of reasons. Amongst them, suicides and illness are the topmost reasons. Of course, in the case of illness, the police officers are in no way responsible. But in the case of suicides, the concerned police officers will be held responsible for negligence. But custodial deaths occurring because of these reasons is not really the biggest concern. The biggest concern is with regard to the possibility of these deaths having occurred as a result of custodial torture or fake encounters. See, police forces in India are known to rely upon torture as an investigative technique in order to draw out a confession from the accused. There have also been incidents where police forces have committed torture in custody in order to settle their personal scores and personal rivalries. Clinical and psychological studies have clearly shown that the use of torture is not just inhuman and a gross violation of human rights, but it is also highly ineffective as an investigation technique. Because a confession drawn through torture is not only illegal and inadmissible in the court of law, but it is also highly unreliable. So in this context, it is very essential to investigate each and every case of custodial death thoroughly and take swift action against the concerned officers if these deaths have occurred as a result of torture or as a result of fake encounters. See, currently, there are a few legal processes in place in order to investigate custodial deaths. For example, custodial deaths cannot be investigated by the police themselves because that represents a clear case of conflict of interest. That's the reason why the law mandates the investigation to be carried out by a committee headed by a judicial magistrate. Next, the law mandates the police forces to report each and every case of custodial death to the National Human Rights Commission. The obligation to report these incidents to the NHRC has been placed on the police forces. And then, the law mandates that the autopsy or the post-mortem has to be videographed in order to ensure that the police do not exert any pressure on the doctors and ensure that the autopsy is carried out in a transparent manner. Then upon this, the law also mandates that the concerned police officers should be immediately suspended until the investigation clears their name. But despite the existence of these legal provisions and checks and balances, police forces are not being adequately held accountable for the excesses committed by them. This becomes evident from the fact that even though some of these custodial deaths of 2017 prima facie appeared to have occurred as a result of torture, not a single policeman has been convicted till date. This highlights the lapses that exist in the legal mechanism, has failed to prevent the wrongful abuse of authority by the law enforcement machinery, and it has failed to hold them accountable for the excesses committed by them. So if this issue has to be addressed, then what we need is wide-sweeping police reforms, which can not only hold the police force accountable for its excesses, but would also transform the police force into a more humane force. Such wide-sweeping police reforms are absolutely essential in order to prevent the wrongful abuse of authority. Take for example, how police forces tend to file wrong charges deliberately in order to seek custody of the accused, and they try to lock them up under non-bailable provisions. If you look at the lockdown, for example, those who violated the lockdown restrictions, they should have ideally been charged under certain provisions of the Indian Penal Code, such as Section 188, and a few other lenient provisions as mandated by the Disaster Management Act and the Epidemic Diseases Act. Section 188 of the IPC provides punishment for disobeying the time restrictions that have been ordered by a public servant. But instead, it has been observed that police forces have deliberately filed charges under serious provisions such as Section 506 of the Indian Penal Code, which covers criminal intimidation. If such serious charges are filed, then the police can push for an order of remand in order to gain custody of the accused and place them under non-bailable arrest. So this prolonged period in custody exposes the accused to the possibility of facing police excesses and police brutality. These aspects and these shortcomings of the legal system have been dealt with in detail by various committees that have been established for recommending police reforms, including the National Police Commission or the Dharamveer Commission, the Second Administrative Reforms Commission or the Second ARC, etc. But most of these recommendations have not been implemented and they are still hanging, and as a result, police forces in India are not being held adequately accountable for the excesses that are being committed by them. Then upon this, the Indian government could consider ratifying the UN Convention Against Torture. Even though India has signed the convention, it is yet to ratify the convention because it fears that it could be targeted at the UN by other countries for geopolitical reasons. But however, if India chooses to ratify the UN Convention Against Torture, it will help bring India's laws in line with the global best practices. Then along with this, the NHRC and as well as the Law Commission of India have recommended to the government to designate torture as a separate crime and to come out with a separate dedicated legislation to penalize custodial torture and custodial deaths. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 in which two leading educational experts evaluate whether online learning can replace classroom learning. Yes, I understand that this column represents a conflict of interest for us, but I assure you that I would be as unbiased and balanced as possible and stick to the opinions that have been expressed by the authors. See, over the last few years, online learning has been gaining a lot of traction around the world as a great supplement to traditional classroom learning. Until a few months ago, online learning was always seen as a supplement to traditional learning. But the breakout of the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the equation entirely, and it has replaced traditional classroom learning with online distance learning. Because the pandemic has forced the closure of schools around the world, and it has pushed governments, educational institutions, and private corporations to shift towards online platforms of learning. So the widespread adoption of online learning has its own set of advantages and as well as disadvantages. First, let us take a look at some of the drawbacks of replacing classroom learning with online learning. See, yesterday we spoke about UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report, which highlighted the drawbacks of completely switching to online learning, especially in low-income and middle-income countries. The biggest drawback is that social inequality and digital inequality can result in a learning divide. As we discussed yesterday, not every family and not every student or teacher can afford access to high-speed internet or have access to gadgets such as smartphones, laptops, etc. Then upon this, poor internet infrastructure in a country can also reduce access to online learning platforms. But of course, questions related to internet access and internet connectivity can be overcome by switching to offline digital learning, but the question of affordability still remains. The next drawback is that the big switch to online learning will significantly increase the screen time of the student. This could affect the mental and physical well-being of the student because constant exposure to the light that is being emitted from the screen could affect the eyes of the student. And studies have also shown that increased screen time to gadgets can alter behavioral patterns of the student. But however, the writers point out that students of this generation are anyways exposed to a higher screen time due to constant usage of mobile phones and television at home. So considering that, online learning can make their exposure to screen time more productive. Plus, the impact of increased screen time on the physical and mental well-being of the student can be brought down by including a mix of activities along with online learning. Along with providing visual content, the teacher and the online learning platforms, they can provide a mix of offline activities in order to reduce the effective screen time. The next drawback is that online learning can never replace the physical and social interaction of a student with his peers and with his teacher. because through these physical and social interactions, a student, especially a young student, learns a number of life skills, and also the classroom environment provides a support system of its own by providing mental and moral support to the students, and it also enables the governments to take care of the nutritional and healthcare needs of the students. Then finally, the sudden switch to online learning could create regulatory problems with regard to quality and pricing due to lack of sufficient guidelines. But apart from this, online learning provides its own set of unique advantages, and with the right intervention, a number of these drawbacks can be overcome. For example, the challenge of access and affordability can be sorted by the government through right investments in telecom infrastructure and by providing right subsidies to the weaker sections who are not able to afford high-speed internet and smart gadgets. Then, as we discussed, the impact of screen time can be brought down through a mix of offline activities, and the regulatory issues can be plugged by the government by coming out with appropriate guidelines. But like I said, online learning can never substitute the physical and social interaction that a student gets to have in a traditional classroom environment where he gets to interact with his peers and his teacher. But apart from this, the other drawbacks can be addressed and can be overcome with the right intervention, and this would allow us to draw benefits from the unique advantages that is provided by online learning, especially during a pandemic. Since the pandemic has forced the closure of schools and disrupted learning, online learning platforms can provide for continuous learning, and it also allows teachers to develop content that is engaging, visually rich and intuitive, which can lead to significant improvement in learning outcomes and make the process of learning a more enjoyable and pleasurable experience. Then upon this, online learning can be scaled up and it will help in bridging the gaps in education. Then finally, distance learning through online platforms can help in increasing retention rates and retain more students within the educational system. So in conclusion, we can say that at lower levels of education, that is at the level of schools, especially elementary schools and colleges, online learning can never be a complete replacement for traditional classroom learning. But instead, online learning can be a very good supplement and a very good value addition as far as lower levels of education is concerned. But at the higher levels, that is with regard to competitive examinations, technical courses, language skills, etc., online learning can definitely be a very good alternative to traditional classroom learning, especially during the pandemic. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that has been written by the Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. In this column, the writer makes use of data from the World Drug Report that is brought out by the UNODC in order to illustrate how the increased economic vulnerability caused by the pandemic can push more people to take up drug usage, to get addicted to drugs, and to get involved in the trafficking of illicit drugs. As per studies conducted by the UNODC, it is the youth, the poor and the marginalized sections, and women and children who are particularly vulnerable to the risk of drug usage and drug addiction, and this in turn could affect our progress towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. Because drug usage and trafficking of drugs can create a variety of socio-economic challenges and as well as security challenges. Drug usage and drug addiction can lead to increased levels of poverty. It can affect education standards and as well as the health standards because drug users are vulnerable to a number of diseases such as HIV, hepatitis, etc. Then upon this, trafficking of drugs can create security challenges because of its close connection with organized crime and terrorism. So increased trafficking of drugs and increased security challenges will divert the attention of governments from pressing socio-economic challenges, and it will lead them to focus more on security challenges. So this not only leads to greater instability, but it also leads to the diversion of precious government funds and resources, and as a result, these factors can affect our progress towards the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. Now let's take up an article from page number 9 that deals with India's relations with Nepal. See, India and Nepal share a deep-rooted civilizational and cultural relationship, and one of the key pillars of this relationship is the close people-to-people relations between the two countries. See, the people of the landlocked country of Nepal are excessively dependent on India for livelihood and economic opportunities. And in turn, Indians also share a close emotional connection with the people of Nepal, and particularly the Madhesis from the Terai belt of Nepal share a familial relationship with the bordering states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. In fact, this cross-border kinship of Madhesi families from the Terai belt is so close with bordering villages in UP and Bihar that India has often described this relationship as roti beti, meaning the Madhesis are not only dependent on the border villages of UP and Bihar for their livelihood, but they also seek out marital relations across the Indian border. So by keeping in mind this close civilizational and cultural relationship that is based on people-to-people relations, both India and Nepal established a system of open borders that provides for free movement of people across the border and provides national treatment to the citizens of both the countries. And this was recognized in the 1950 Treaty of Peace and Friendship that was signed between both the countries. But over the years, the India-Nepal relationship has suffered due to a number of reasons. One such reason is the recent emergence of a border dispute at Kala Pani and the passage of the second constitutional amendment by the Nepali parliament, which has altered the political map of Nepal that directly challenges India's territorial claims. Apart from the recent border dispute that traces back its origin to the Treaty of Sugauli, the other issue that has plagued the India-Nepal relationship is the discrimination faced by the Madhesis of the Terai belt at the hands of the political elite of Nepal. If you remember, we had this discussion recently on the 22nd of June, and while discussing a practice question, we spoke about the proposed amendments to Nepal Citizenship Act which can significantly affect Indian interests, in particular the interests of Madhesi families from the Terai belt. The proposed amendments to the Citizenship Act of Nepal makes it difficult for foreign wives of Nepali men to acquire Nepali citizenship. It places a mandatory waiting period of 7 years, and this is bound to affect Madhesi families who frequently seek out marital relations across the border in UP and Bihar. As we discussed the other day, Madhesis are already protesting against this proposed amendment, and in this context, India has expressed concern about the proposed changes to Nepal citizenship law, and it has reiterated the close cultural and civilizational links that India has with Nepal. Now let's take up an article from page number 10. The Panchayati Raj Ministry has demanded a 5-fold increase in its funding allocation by the Finance Commission. The Panchayati Raj Ministry has met with the 15th Finance Commission and has asked for 10 lakh crore rupees to be allocated for the period 2020-21 to 2025-26, considering the increasing significance of grassroots institutions in transforming decentralized governance. During its presentation to the 15th Finance Commission, the Ministry has highlighted that its funding allocation had tripled between the 13th and 14th Finance Commissions, and over the last 4 years, it has displayed an impressive utilization rate of 78%. It shows that the Ministry has utilized a majority of the funds that had been allocated, and hence additional funding has been sought by the Ministry by keeping in mind the increasing role of panchayats and decentralized institutions during the pandemic. For example, the Ministry has proposed to establish community kitchens by self-help groups in each and every panchayat in order to provide for cooked food and solve the problem of hunger which has become very apparent during the pandemic. The Ministry has also said that the role of panchayats is going to increase in the coming days because of the recently launched Garib Kalyan Rozgar Abhiyan, which seeks to provide employment opportunities to migrant workers who have returned back to their native villages as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown. So to deal with these additional expenses, the Panchayat Raj Ministry has sought additional allocation of funds from the 15th Finance Commission. Now let's take up an article from page number 11 in which the Chief of ISRO, K. Sivan, sheds more light on the structure, the mandate and the role of IN-SPACE, which is a newly constituted entity under the Department of Space. We have already covered this topic in our yesterday's analysis, but this article provides us a greater insight into the structure, mandate and the role of IN-SPACE. See, the ISRO chief has made it clear that IN-SPACE will function autonomously and it will be independent of ISRO. IN-SPACE, which stands for Indian Space Promotion and Authorization Center, will be headed by its own chairperson, who would be assisted by a board of members from the private industry. Of course, the board would also have some representation from the government and from ISRO as well. The ISRO chief has said that the mandate of IN-SPACe would be to primarily act as the regulator of space industry. Because see, right now, India has opened up its space sector to private participation, and these activities, which include satellite building, rocket building, commercial launches, etc., which henceforth would include private participation, would have to be regulated, and this task falls on the newly constituted entity, that is IN-SPACe. Along with this, IN-SPACe would also be responsible for creating a level playing field for ensuring the participation of the private industry in India's space program. The chief of ISRO has said that IN-SPACe will function along with New Space India Limited, which was constituted last year under the Department of Space, to significantly increase private participation in the space program so that ISRO can set aside its precious time, resources and funds which can be used to focus on research and development, space exploration, etc. Because other routine activities such as satellite building, rocket building and commercial launches can be slowly outsourced to the private sector entirely. Then the ISRO chief has also said that there is a need to revise India's satellite navigation policy. Because see, satellite navigation involves the strategic military element as well. So by keeping this in mind, the ISRO chief has said that existing navigation policies such as the remote sensing data policy and SATCOM policy of 2000 are outdated, and hence these satellite navigation policies have to be revised and updated. The revised policy will have to factor in the strategic and military applications of satellite navigation. Now let's take up another article from page number 11. The Financial Action Task Force has brought out its first ever report on illegal wildlife trade. See, as we all know, the FATF essentially deals with money laundering and terror financing. These are the primary objectives of FATF. But FATF is also concerned about wildlife trafficking because the proceeds of revenue generated through wildlife trafficking is also laundered. So due to these connections between wildlife trafficking and money laundering, there also exists a close connection with other forms of organized crime such as modern slavery, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, etc. So eventually, wildlife trafficking also ends up having a connection with terror financing as well. Take for example, how Northeast insurgent outfits raise revenue through illegal wildlife trade and drug trafficking in order to procure illegal weapons. So hence, the FATF has also started focusing on illegal wildlife trade, and it has brought out its first ever report in which it identifies illegal wildlife trade as a global threat. According to the report, the global revenue generated through illegal wildlife trade stands at around $23 billion, and the report points out how the traffickers misuse the legal channels that exist for trading in wildlife products. The report goes on to highlight the intricate mechanisms and processes that traffickers have evolved in order to conceal their illegal activities. The report shows how business organizations are used as a cover or a front to launder the proceeds of illegal wildlife trade, which eventually results in increased tax evasion, fraud, and corruption in the system. The report also shows how traffickers are exploiting online marketplaces, social media platforms, and the dark net in order to carry out their illicit activities by staying away from the surveillance of security agencies. This report of the FATF also praises India for amending its Prevention of Money Laundering Act in 2012, which removed a threshold value of 30 lakh rupees that was earlier placed on the proceeds of illegal wildlife trade. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. The Maguri Motapung Beel or wetland, recently seen in news, is located near which protected area? The correct answer is option A. It is located near the Dibru-Saikhowa National Park and Biosphere Reserve in Assam. See, this question has been asked because we have a related article on page number 5. See, the recent oil well blowout that occurred in Assam, which was being operated by Oil India Limited, occurred very close to the ecologically sensitive Maguri Motapung wetland, which falls within the eco-sensitive region of the Dibru-Saikhowa National Park and Biosphere Reserve. So to account for this environmental damage, the National Green Tribunal has ordered Oil India Limited to to pay a compensation of 25 crore rupees. See, the Dibru-Saikhowa National Park and Biosphere Reserve is located on the south bank of the Brahmaputra River in the extreme east of Assam. This protected area is bound by the Brahmaputra River and the Lohit River in the north and by the Dibru River in the south. Please look at this map. This is where the Dibru-Saikhowa National Park and Biosphere is located in the extreme east of Assam. This map also shows the other 17 biosphere reserves of India, and over here you can see that the Dibru-Saikhowa National Park is bound by the Brahmaputra and as well as by the Lohit to the north and by the Dibru River to the south. This map also shows the Maguri Motapung wetland, which is located very close to the oil well that blew out recently. So this oil disaster is posing a grave threat to the sensitive ecology and biodiversity of this region. And also note that in the Dibru-Saikhowa National Park and Biosphere Reserve, you come across semi-evergreen forests, deciduous forests, littoral forests, and swamp forests, and as well as small patches of wet evergreen forests. This national park is particularly known for having the largest Salix swamp forest in northeastern India, and it is known for the natural regeneration of the Salix trees. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The National Commission for Protection of Child Rights is a constitutional body. It falls under the administrative control of the Ministry of Women and Child Development. The Commission's mandate is to ensure that all laws, policies, programs, and administrative mechanisms are in consonance with the child rights perspective as enshrined in the Constitution of India and also the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect, so the correct answer is option D, 2 and 3 only. See, the first statement is incorrect because the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights is not a constitutional body. Instead, it is a statutory body which was established in 2005 by passing the Commission for Protection of Child Rights Act. This question has been asked because we have this small article on page number 8 that makes a reference to the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? While stratospheric ozone protects us from harmful ultraviolet radiation of the sun, ground level ozone is toxic and is treated as an air pollutant. Ground level ozone is directly emitted by vehicles and industrial activities. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is correct, but the second statement is incorrect. So option A is the right answer. See, ozone behaves differently based on its location in the atmosphere. Stratospheric ozone protects us from the harmful UV radiation of the sun. But if ozone is formed at the ground level, then it is treated as an atmospheric pollutant because it can aggravate asthma conditions and it can lead to severe respiratory issues. This ground level ozone is not emitted from any direct source, and instead it is formed through a series of photochemical reactions between oxides of nitrogen, that is NOx, and VOCs, that is volatile organic compounds, in the presence of sunlight. This question has been asked because according to a report brought out by the Center for Science and Environment, ground level ozone pollution has increased during the lockdown. Now let's take up the next practice question. The Aegis ballistic missile defense system has been developed by the United States. Option B is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, Japan has decided to scrap the deployment of the Aegis ballistic missile defense system developed by the United States after facing opposition from local residents. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? Hydrogen-based economy is the use of hydrogen as a low carbon fuel for heating and also for powering vehicles, and is being developed as part of a low carbon economy in order to phase out fossil fuels and limit global warming. Conventional methods of generating hydrogen by steam methane reforming results in a large output of carbon dioxide. Electrochemical splitting of water, called as water electrolysis, is a clean and highly efficient technology for large-scale production of high purity H2. All the three statements are correct, so option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 16, IIT Madras has tied up with a German institute in order to produce high purity hydrogen in order to enable India's transition towards a hydrogen-based economy, and it plans to produce this high purity hydrogen through the water electrolysis method, which is more cleaner and highly efficient. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2019 prelims paper. Which of the following are located in the Agastya Malai Biosphere Reserve? The correct answer is option A. These wildlife sanctuaries and tiger reserves mentioned under option A are located in the Agastya Malai Biosphere Reserve, which is located at the border of Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: while enforcing the COVID-19 lockdown, numerous cases of police excesses, including the excessive use of force, arbitrary violence, and even custodial deaths, were reported. Examine the factors contributing to this disturbing trend in the police forces with examples and suggest possible reforms. The second question: can online learning replace the school classroom? Discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.